Colorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents How We Win the Civil War, Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good, by Steve Phillips. Read by Bill Andrew Quinn. Introduction. A choice between democracy and whiteness. I decided to reach out to a friend, Taylor Branch, the esteemed historian of the civil rights movement, to hear his thoughts. He was translating this through the lens of Martin Luther King Jr.'s 13-year campaign for social justice. So the real question would be, he said finally, if people were given the choice between democracy and whiteness, how many would choose whiteness? We let that settle in the air, neither of us willing to hazard a guess to that one. Isabel Wilkerson, Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents. Families frequently take trips to our nation's capital. It is common to see parents with their children in Washington, D.C., visiting the iconic institutions of the country's democracy. Shortly after the Christmas holidays in 2020, Lisa, a 57-year-old white woman who worked as a nurse in Georgia, decided to make the 10-hour drive from Tennessee to D.C. with her son Eric, a white 30-year-old Nashville resident. On Monday, January 4, 2021, they arrived in D.C. and checked in at the Grand Hyatt Hotel, 5 blocks from the White House and 3 blocks from Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated days after the end of the Civil War. On Wednesday, mother and son made their way to the National Mall, a 1.8-mile stretch of land that encompasses grassy fields, a reflecting pool that is more than 2,000 feet long, and gravel paths for walking or running. At one end of the mall sits the Lincoln Memorial, the monument honoring the president who won the Civil War and the site where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his historic 1963 I Have a Dream speech to 250,000 people and a national television audience. At the other end is the United States Capitol, the building where Congress convenes and where presidents are sworn into office. A stroll from one end of the mall to the other takes a visitor past the White House, the Washington Monument, the National Gallery of Art, and various Smithsonian museums, including the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Perhaps more than any other 2-mile stretch of terrain in this country, the National Mall represents and celebrates the essence of democracy in America. As Lisa and Eric walked across the grass toward the Capitol, the United States Congress and Vice President Mike Pence were engaged in the last step in the country's democratic process, affirming the votes of the American people and certifying Joe Biden as the winner of the election, an outcome that had been confirmed by the top elections officials in all 50 states, Republicans and Democrats alike. When Lisa and Eric entered the mall on January 6th and turned toward the Capitol, Lisa was wearing jeans, a plaid flannel shirt, glasses, and a red Make America Great Again ski cap. She was also wearing a bulletproof vest. Her son Eric had on a baseball cap, a long-sleeve shirt with a military fatigues pattern, and matching pants. He also had a bulletproof vest matching one his mother was wearing. The two met up with and joined thousands of other people who were angry that Donald Trump had come out on the losing end of America's democratic process. As the crowd grew increasingly unruly and confrontational, Lisa and her son reveled in the conflict. Many people tried to breach the barricades protecting the country's elected representatives from the restive mob, and Lisa egged on the protesters. One person who had tried to enter the building came back to the crowd and reported that a tear gas package was thrown in the Congress. The crowd cheered. The man further shared that Congress is shut down. Lisa laughed and said, "Oh my God, that is one of my best days to note that they got tear gassed." By they, Lisa meant the country's democratically elected representatives. The man continued to elaborate on his confrontation with the law enforcement officials who were protecting the members of Congress, saying, "I got maced, and I punched 2 of them in the face." "Good," Lisa responded. "While everyone else was on the couch, you guys were training and getting ready." Not long after Lisa commended the man who had punched 2 police officers in the face, the crowd turned completely violent, tore down the barricades protecting the citadel of democracy, and surged to the building's entrance. Fearing for the safety and lives of the people they were sworn to protect, the Capitol Police evacuated the Vice President and all the members of Congress. Multiple media outlets have recounted the details of the violence of the insurrection. The New York Times account conveyed that one officer lost the tip of his right index finger. Others were smashed in the head with baseball bats, flagpoles, and pipes. Another lost consciousness after rioters used a metal barrier to push her into stairs as they tried to reach the Capitol steps during the assault. D.C. Metropolitan Police Officer Michael Fanone was pulled into the crowd, beaten with a flagpole, and repeatedly tased with his own taser, CNN reported. In addition, rioters stole his badge and grabbed at his service gun. When rioters said they should kill him with his own gun, Fanone pleaded with the mob and told them, "I have kids." Fanone lost consciousness, suffered a heart attack, and was hospitalized after the clashes. Video coverage of the attack shows Officer Daniel Hodges crushed in a doorway between a massive press of rioters and the police line, writhing and screaming in pain. The video shows one of the rioters grabbing at Hodges' helmet and trying to rip it off. Sergeant Aquilino Gonell was beaten with a flagpole. His hand was sliced open. A CNN article published 7 months after the attack revealed that Gonell still has a vivid memory of what he faced, of the pepper spray that forced him and other officers from the front line, of the American flagpoles, rocks, and even guardrails pried from the inaugural stage that were used to attack officers, and of the struggle to keep the flood of insurrectionists from forcing their way through the door he was guarding. Gonell shared, "I bled, I sweat, and I fought to prevent those people coming in through that entrance. We literally were fighting inch by inch, and I could hear them, 'We're going to shoot you. We're going to kill you. You're choosing your paycheck over the country. You're a disgrace. You're a traitor.'" All told, 140 police officers were injured defending democracy that day, and 4 officers died by suicide in the days and weeks after the attack. After the police finally regained control of the Capitol, Lisa and Eric left the building and headed back to their hotel. The next day, as they loaded their car and prepared for the long drive back to Nashville, they took the time to talk to a reporter from the Sunday Times of London and shared their motivations for participating in the unprecedented and violent effort to block the peaceful transfer of power. As Lisa put it, "The left has everything: the media, organizations, the government. We have to organize if we're going to fight back and be heard." Lisa also shared that a violent revolution has long been on the cards thanks to last year's racial justice protests, anti-police riots, and unnecessary coronavirus lockdowns. With tears in her eyes, and apparently while eating a hot dog, Lisa defiantly declared, "I'd rather die as a 57-year-old woman than live under oppression. I'd rather die and would rather fight." Like mother, like son, Eric extended the military metaphor, saying, "We wanted to show that we're willing to rise up, band together, and fight if necessary, same as our forefathers who established this country in 1776. And with that, mother and son climbed into the car and set off on the road trip back home, their family trip to the nation's capital complete. 4 days later, the police located and arrested Eric back in Nashville. When federal agents searched his home, they found 15 firearms, including an assault rifle, a sniper rifle with a tripod, pistols, shotguns, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Lisa and her son certainly did not choose democracy on that January day. They chose to try to disrupt and destroy democracy, and they were not alone. The Insurrection Index, an online database, has more than 1,000 entries of people who participated in the attempted coup of the U.S. government, nurses like Lisa, bartenders like Eric, and also elected officials, students, teachers, business people. One wealthy man, also from Tennessee, invited his friends to travel on his private jet to the insurrection in the Capitol. An article in Vanity Fair noted, "A murmur began to bubble among Memphis's lily-white country club elite. Did you hear John Dobbs flew his buddies to the Capitol on his private jet?" While the insurrectionists did not choose democracy, many of them did choose whiteness. As Nicole Austin Hillary, executive director of the U.S. program at Human Rights Watch, wrote in a blog post with her colleague Victoria Strang on the anniversary of the attack, "There is power in truth, and the truth about the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol is this. Racism and a fear of growing diversity in the United States was at the heart of the violence. While then-President Donald Trump encouraged demonstrators to retake the nation under the guise of halting certification of the 2020 election results, racism was in the roots of, and remains embedded in, this movement." The Washington Post ran an extensive analysis of the participants in the insurrection and the symbols they carried, finding that assembled in the crowd were a range of far-right groups, including self-described militias, white nationalists, and sundry conspiracists and agitators. The black police officers who defended the leaders overseeing the democratic process of certifying the election that day have confirmed the prevalence of racism among the insurrectionists. In his testimony before the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack, U.S. Capitol officer Harry Dunn said, "One woman in a pink MAGA shirt yelled, 'You hear that, guys? This nigger voted for Joe Biden.' Then the crowd, perhaps around 20 people, joined in, screaming, 'Boo, fucking nigger.'" Dunn added that his fellow black officers experienced similar treatment, and he told the committee that one officer told me he had never, in his entire 40 years of life, been called a nigger to his face, and that streak ended on January 6th. Yet another black officer later told me that he had been confronted by insurrectionists inside the Capitol, who told him to "put your gun down and we'll show you what kind of nigger you really are." It was in November of 2018 that Taylor Branch framed the chilling question for Isabel Wilkerson. If people were given the choice between democracy and whiteness, how many would choose whiteness? Just over 2 years later, a proudly pro-white president who had lost a free and fair election incited his followers to march in the Capitol and stop democracy in its tracks. With the Confederate flag flying in their midst, they descended on the citadel of democracy, beat police officers over the head with flagpoles, and hunted down the country's elected officials, with many in the mob yelling racist slurs. As horrifying, tragic, and deadly as the 2020 post-election attempted coup was, it was not the first time a large percentage of the American people chose whiteness over democracy in the wake of an election whose outcome they did not like. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 on a platform that denounced the slave trade as a burning shame to our country, cries of outrage echoed across the country. Newspapers warned that Lincoln intends to use every means to instigate revolt among the slaves. They will cut the throat of every white man and distribute the white females among the Negroes. Defenders of slavery plotted to murder Lincoln before he could even take office. In the weeks following the 1860 election, state legislatures voted to secede from the rest of the country because, as the South Carolina secession resolution said, "A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery." 5 states quickly followed suit, and before Lincoln could take the oath of office, they all came together in the Congress of the Confederacy, where they unequivocally rejected the outcome of the democratic process and unapologetically chose whiteness. Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens made it quite clear that not only were the Southern states rejecting the democratic outcome of the election of the country to which they belonged, but that they were enthusiastically choosing whiteness. In his 1861 cornerstone speech, he forthrightly explained that the Confederate government's foundations are laid, Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. 3 weeks later, in that century's post-election paroxysm of anti-democratic feelings, the losing side embraced violence, death, and destruction, and went on to wage the nation's bloodiest war, a 4-year war in which 2% of the country's population killed one another, the modern-day equivalent of 7 million people being killed. As will be shown in the chapters of this book, Americans have consistently underestimated the political appeal of whiteness. Lincoln and his allies were taken by surprise at the ferocity of the opposition to his election in 1860. In the 1924 presidential election, neither political party could muster the votes at their respective conventions to pass a resolution condemning the Ku Klux Klan. In 1948, South Carolina native son Strom Thurmond ran a third-party presidential bid as the head of the proudly pro-segregationist Dixiecrat Party and won 4 states outright. 20 years later, proud white segregationist Alabama Governor George Wallace mounted his own third-party presidential bid in 1968, quintupling the Dixiecrat vote share, winning 5 states and securing 13.5% of the national popular vote, the equivalent of 22 million votes in the 2020 election. In 1990, 22 years after Wallace's candidacy, former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard David Duke shocked the political establishment in his run to become the U.S. Senator of Louisiana, winning 43.5% of the vote and displaying far greater vote-getting power than anyone wanted to admit. And then came Trump. Trump rocketed to the head of the pack of Republican presidential candidates in 2015 after spewing racist vitriol, including demonizing Mexicans and Muslims. The media and public once again underestimated the appeal of white resentment, with nationally syndicated columnist Ann McFetters expressing the sentiments of many Americans in 2015 with a piece titled, "Relax, folks, Trump won't win, and America will remain great." In that column, McFetters wrote what most hoped and believed, namely that Trump cannot be elected president in a general election because he is losing women and independent voters by a 2-to-1 margin. In the end, the majority of Republican voters will not nominate an angry white male bigot who has publicly, insistently said awful things about immigrants, women, minorities, and basically anyone who isn't rich and intolerant like he is. Welp, not only did Trump win, but after 4 years of incompetence, racism, misogyny, and impeachment, he received 11 million more votes than he did in 2016, garnering the support of 74 million Americans. Writer Ta-Nehisi Coates brilliantly stripped away any pretense regarding the painful reality that, when choosing Trump, many people were choosing whiteness. In a 2017 essay in The Atlantic, Coates went to the heart of the matter. The triumph of Trump's campaign of bigotry presented the problematic spectacle of an American president succeeding at best in spite of his racism and possibly even because of it. Trump removed the questions of racism from the euphemistic and plausibly deniable to the realm of the overt and freely claimed. This presented the country's thinking class with a dilemma. It simply could not be that Hillary Clinton was correct when she asserted that a large group of Americans was endorsing a president because of bigotry. The implications that systemic bigotry is still central to our politics, that the country is susceptible to that bigotry, that the salt-of-the-earth Americans whom we lionize in our culture and politics are not so different from those same Americans who grin back at us in lynching photos, are just too dark. In 2021, 4 years after writing that Atlantic article, after an entire Trump administration and an outright insurrection and attempted coup, Coates reflected on the racial wreckage of the Trump administration, writing a follow-up article titled, "Donald Trump is Out. Are we ready to talk about how he got in?" In that piece, Coates offered his customary trenchant observations that define the moment in which we find ourselves, writing, It is still deeply challenging for so many people to accept the reality of what has happened, that a country has been captured by the worst of its history, while millions of Americans cheered this on. In 2020 and 2021, millions of Americans chose whiteness wrapped up in a proudly white nationalist white man in America's White House. Never in the history of the country has the losing side sought to block the certification process of a national election, but Donald Trump rallied his supporters to do just that. And yet, as of January 2022, a full year after the insurrection, nearly 70% of Republicans wanted Trump to run for president again in 2024. It is not hyperbole to say that the political power of whiteness in this country has grown steadily, if not exponentially. Despite the mountain of evidence that the battle still rages over whether this is fundamentally a white nation or a multiracial democracy, too few Democrats and progressives recognize the seriousness of the fight we're in. And, if they do, they are too timid and fearful to speak the truths that need to be spoken. As Washington Post columnist Perry Bacon warned in 2021, in basically every major institution in America, there are powerful figures who I doubt voted for Donald Trump, but nonetheless play down the radicalism of the Republican Party, belittle those who speak honestly about it, or otherwise act in ways that make it harder to combat that radicalism. That needs to change. Americans desperately need leaders and institutions that are fully grappling with Republicans' dangerous anti-democratic drift. Although Joe Biden, to his credit, launched his presidential campaign with a condemnation of the 2017 white nationalist march in Charlottesville, Virginia, that turned violent and deadly, calling it a moment of truth for the country, we have heard little from Biden or many Democrats about said moment of truth since then. The fact that the Biden administration let the voting rights fight languish for a year while it pursued the tantalizing talisman of bipartisan support for the infrastructure bill spoke volumes about its flawed assessment of this historical moment. In the minds of too many in the White House and Capitol Hill, political success depends more on wooing white voters and trying to assuage their fears than it does on tapping and unleashing the energy of the millions of people of color who are rapidly changing the composition of this country. Even more alarming is that many in the Democratic Party and progressive movement leadership believe that it is a losing battle to challenge voters to embrace the concept that America is a multiracial democracy and not a white nationalist country. Fearing the political costs and consequences, and shockingly unable to count or use a spreadsheet to quantify the electoral power of the demographic revolution, they continue to run away from the central issue. And they do this to disastrous consequences, as was seen at the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial election, in the state that was the literal capital of the Confederacy, when Republican nominee Glenn Youngkin was able to unlock the code of white racial anxiety and thereby boost voter turnout by chanting the words critical race theory, scaring whites into believing that the realities of racism and our nation's racist history might be taught in the state schools. Meanwhile, Democratic nominee Terry McAuliffe was unable or unwilling, or both, to aggressively define the fight and wage the battle. There were no condemnations of white supremacy, proclamations that taking on racism was a moment of truth, or affirmations of his intent to champion racial justice and equality. And he lost, in a state Biden had won handily just 12 months earlier. One of the biggest impediments to progress in this moment is the Democratic consultant class, which, for the most part, has little experience with or understanding of how racism actually works in America. Despite the overarching victories of 2020 that ousted Trump and flipped the U.S. Senate, unaccountable yet influential consultants continue to cherry-pick and misinterpret data about the 2020 election, overlook the real results, and offer a course of action that is like leading lambs to a McAuliffe-like slaughter. Even after the victories in 2020 in the formerly red states of Georgia and Arizona, states with large and growing communities of color, Democrats remain reluctant to define and engage the actual fight we're facing. A fight characterized by the battle for justice, equality, and inclusion by people of color and their allies on the one hand, and by a virulent, fear-based white backlash on the other. Data scientist David Shor is a leading proponent of what has come to be known as popularism, a school of thought described by New York Times columnist Ezra Klein as the belief that Democrats should do a lot of polling to figure out which of their views are popular and which are not popular, and then they should talk about the popular stuff and shut up about the unpopular stuff. For a data geek, Shor's math is surprisingly off, and as of this writing in May of 2022, he had yet to reconcile his assertion that the Democratic Party is losing support among people of color with the fact that Democrats across the board significantly increased the number of votes they received from people of color. Most dangerous is that Shor and his cohort are prescribing a course of action that would be politically fatal in that it would reduce the enthusiasm of voters of color, who are the most reliable Democratic voters and the fastest-growing segment of the population. At root, although they are reluctant to say this explicitly, the popularists advise that Democrats abandon and distance themselves from the issues that most affect people of color, issues such as the racial wealth gap, reimagining policing and public safety, and immigration reform. These are the realities that directly flow from the fact that our opponents are and have been waging a war to keep this nation a white-dominated one for more than a century. What they are offering with their popularist prescriptions is analogous to Lincoln had he tried to rally support in 1864, in the middle of the Civil War, by focusing exclusively on tariffs on agricultural goods while carefully avoiding talking about the unpopular, harsh reality of slavery. To his credit, Lincoln's platform did emphatically insert that slavery was the cause and now constitutes the strength of this rebellion, and it went on to demand slavery's utter and complete extirpation from the soil of the Republic. To be sure, such ambivalence about equality is nothing new. There were plenty of David Shors in Lincoln's time. One such proponent of post-Civil War popularism was Union General Charles Wainwright, who lamented that Lincoln was under the influence of a small number of abolitionist political leaders who had Negro on the brain. One enterprising artist even created a drawing of black people curled into the shape of a top hat sitting on Lincoln's head. Lincoln himself was racked with indecision and vacillation, even going so far as tasking General Benjamin Butler with running the numbers on what it would cost to ship black folks back to Africa. 100 years later, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson both tried to get the civil rights leaders to tone down their protests and slow down their march toward freedom, with LBJ telling Dr. King in late 1964 that pushing for a voting rights bill was just not the wise and the politically expedient thing to do. Sound familiar? Given the truly existential nature of the fight before us and the fundamental failure of those in positions of power to recognize and properly respond to the moment, I had to write this book. When the New Press first approached me in mid-2020 about writing another book, I told them I was thinking about using the Civil War framework as a theoretical construct to explain contemporary U.S. politics. Then white nationalists carrying the Confederate flag stormed the Capitol wearing sweatshirts actually inscribed with the words, MAGA, Civil War, January 6, 2021. The purpose of this book is twofold. First, I am trying to sound the alarm that our opponents are engaged in a continuation of the Civil War, have just recently tried to destroy democracy and move us into fascism, and are actively at work to do it again. Second, I aim to help illuminate the path to victory by putting the places that have successfully flipped from red to blue under the microscope to understand how these states and regions, and the key leaders and organizations there, succeeded and what lessons they offer for the coming months and years. The book is accordingly divided into two parts. Part 1 focuses on how the Civil War never ended, and the Confederates soldier on. to this day. Part 2 shows how we win. Then, in the epilogue,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?